Dwell upon that passage from Isaiah chapter 9. Our main text today will be coming from Isaiah 7, so if you just want to put a bookmarker there, we will be getting there to Isaiah 7 in just a moment. But when we think about a passage like Isaiah 9, it's very easy for us in hindsight to say, clearly a messianic prophecy. Who wouldn't see the Messiah there? All the details line up, all the bullet points are right there. That is clearly a messianic prophecy. We see the picture of the Messiah being painted by Isaiah in that passage. And I don't think that's wrong. I mean, it is absolutely a messianic prophecy, as is Isaiah 7, which we'll get to here in just a moment. We were studying in our Bible class this morning from 2 Samuel 7, and that's another passage that is obviously, in hindsight, messianic in nature. It's quoted in Acts chapter 2. It's quoted in Hebrews chapter 1 in a messianic context. And so I want to ask, though, do we sometimes take it for granted that hindsight is 20/20 with a lot of messianic prophecies? That from our perspective as Christians, as people looking at it from a new covenant perspective, we can go through the Old Testament and we can see, oh yeah, Deuteronomy 18, messianic, Psalm 22, messianic, Psalm 110, messianic, and we can line up all these prophecies from our future perspective and very rightly identify them as pointing toward Jesus Christ and being fulfilled in Jesus Christ alone. But I think we take it for granted that we can see all those messianic pictures and themes in the Bible. And in doing so, do we miss the huge lessons that come from looking at those prophecies in their original context? I want to do that with you this morning in Isaiah chapter 7 because there's a little something from Isaiah 7 that, again, we take it absolutely for granted as Christians that Jesus was born of a virgin woman. That is one of the core concepts, by the way, of the gospel story, that Mary, the mother of Jesus, became pregnant by the Holy Spirit, that she was made to be pregnant by the power of God and not because she had had a human relationship with a husband or any other man for that matter. And again, we take that for granted. That's at the core of the gospel message, is the virgin birth of Jesus. And we quote from Isaiah 7, and it says that a son will be given to you, or a sign will be given to you, a virgin shall be with child, and he'll be called Emmanuel. And we go, yep, messianic prophecy right there. It's quoted in Matthew chapter 1, obviously messianic. Have you ever read Isaiah 7, though? Like when you actually go and read Isaiah 7, you go, that's kind of a weird chapter. And really, Isaiah 7, in its immediate context, is about a guy named Ahaz, not Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus, not even Jesus himself. Again, in the immediate context, Isaiah 7 is about a wicked king in Judah named Ahaz, not to be confused with the other wicked king Ahab, but we're talking Ahaz with a Z, and he was bad. And when I talk about bad with kings in the Old Testament, there's really bad and then there's triple B, which is what? Baby burning bad. That's triple B. When you're triple B and you're baby burning bad, that's the baddest of the bad. And Ahaz was one of those triple B kings where he made his sons pass through the fire, which means that he literally took his children and he made them go into a furnace to be burned alive as a sacrifice to the pagan gods. That's how bad Ahaz was. And in the midst of his story, the prophet Isaiah comes to him and says, God will give you a sign if you just ask for it. Anything you want. And we'll get to that in just a second. Now, you might not normally think of Ahaz and Joseph having any kind of connection. You're like, well, wicked king from the Old Testament who burned his babies to sacrifice them as to idols. And Joseph, the humble and righteous man of God who dutifully married his betrothed and raised the Lord's anointed. What's the connection between those two characters? Well, there's a term that I've used before. It's not a Ryan Goodwin term or anything like that. It's a term that's used in understanding biblical literature called type, antitype. And in short, let me explain what type, antitype is. It's when you look at biblical characters, you can see Old Testament characters who essentially foreshadow New Testament characters. More often than not, they foreshadow Jesus Christ. Adam is called a type of Jesus by Paul. He's explicitly called a type in Romans chapter 5 and again referenced in 1 Corinthians 15. In a lot of ways, you could see that Isaac is a type of Jesus. Isaac was offered by his father on the Mount of Sacrifice, and Jesus is the Isaac who's offered by his father. David is a type of Jesus. You see that clearly. Solomon in 2 Samuel 7 is a type of Jesus. And what is essentially this Old Testament character is the type who foreshadows Jesus, who is the antitype. Not that he's anti, like the opposite of him, but that he's a reflection. The reflection that you see in the mirror is your antitype. It's the reflection looking back at you. And so these Old Testament characters are a type. The New Testament is the antitype. We don't always talk about type, antitype of non-Jesus characters, though. But I think Ahaz and Joseph are a perfect example of a type, antitype. And this time they're being contrasted, not compared to each other. Let me give you a few things here about Ahaz and Joseph. Both of them are descendants of David. Both of them come at a low point in the Davidic line. For Ahaz, he comes at a spiritual low point where the Davidic line is offering children as sacrifices to idols. Joseph comes at a low point in terms of the political power. I mean, he's a descendant of David, but what kind of person is he? He's just a lowly nobody, living in Nazareth, working as a carpenter. He's just a regular Joe with nothing special to his name. And yet, he's a descendant of David. Both of them face a crisis at this difficult moment in life and a choice as well. You've got a choice to make right now. Ahaz, what's it going to be? Joseph, you have a choice to make right now. What's it going to be? Both of them are reassured by a messenger of God. Ahaz is reassured by Isaiah the prophet. Joseph is reassured by the angel of the Lord. Both of them are offered by this messenger a sign. And the sign, by the way, is the same sign. That there will be a virgin with child, and that will be the sign of God. Same sign. It's in their response that we see a divergence, and it's a divergence that you're going to see it all make sense at the end of the lesson. This is, by the way, this is one of those lessons that I get really excited about, that hopefully you see where I'm going with it in the end. We're going to talk about a bunch of stuff, and at the end of the lesson, it's all going to come together, and hopefully we'll all go, oh, that's where he was going with that. So let's start with Ahaz, okay? We got Ahaz, we got Joseph, we've got the sign of a virgin with child, and that's the thing that's connecting them right now. That's the connective tissue between two characters who seem at first to have nothing to do with each other. So Ahaz was king of the southern tribe of Judah, okay, that southern kingdom. You know, when the kingdom of Israel split and the northern tribes went one way and Judah and Benjamin went another way, and the line of David continued in Jerusalem in the kingdom of Judah. And so these tribes have split. Ahaz is king in Judah. And things have gone actually pretty well for Judah for quite some time now. Ahaz comes after a series of 4 relatively good kings in Judah's history. Now, they all have faults of their own, and it's not like their stories are all perfect, but they were 4 kings in a row who were assessed by the writer as, and he did right in the sight of the Lord, to lesser and greater extents. But those 4 kings that Ahaz follows, as you're going to see from the biblical text, is Joash, Amaziah, Uzziah, he's also called Azariah in other texts, and Jotham. And I think 2 Chronicles 27 verse 6 sums up the state of things in Judah when Jotham is king and his son Ahaz is waiting in the ranks. 2 Chronicles 27 verse 6 says, Jotham became mighty because he ordered his ways before the Lord his God. And if you combine Judah with the northern tribes under Jeroboam II, if you combine their total land area, their kingdoms easily rival Solomon's kingdom when it was at its height. So for both the northern tribes and the southern tribes, this was like a renaissance for Israel and Judah in terms of their power, their wealth, their prestige, the expanse of their borders. Things were going really well, and Ahaz inherits a really good situation in Judah. But underneath the good situation, there was rot, as there often is. At the same time that guys like Uzziah, a relatively good king, and Jotham, a relatively good thing, at the same time that these are kings in Judah doing good things and pleasing the Lord, you had prophets like Isaiah and Amos coming in there and castigating them for their wealth and luxury and opulence and their vanity. Under King Uzziah, again, a good king, Amos had this to say in Amos chapter 6, those who recline on beds of ivory and sprawl on their couches and eat lambs from the flock and calves from the midst of the stall, and they improvise to the sound of the harp, and like David have composed songs for themselves, who drink wine from sacrificial bowls while they anoint themselves with the finest of oils, and yet they've not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. Therefore, they will now go into exile at the head of the exiles, and the sprawlers' banqueting will pass away. That was Amos's commentary. During a time when there were actually good kings in Judah, there was still this spiritual rot happening under the surface. And it was vanity and luxury and wanton living, where they were living for pleasure and for stuff and for riches. And idolatry was never really kicked, was it? Idolatry was always there in the background, like an addiction that will never be fully subdued, but will always be in the back of your mind. So what Ahaz inherits is, yes, politically and economically a good situation. But Ahaz is the man of the hour, and when he reintroduces idolatry to Judah, it's amazing how quickly everybody's on board with it. The text describes it as he offered sacrifices to the gods on every high place and under every green tree. It's almost like everywhere you found a green tree, there was idolatry happening under Ahaz. Every high place, every hill had its idolatry going on. He reintroduces idolatry, and it just explodes in Judah under his leadership. Brief timeline of the reign of Ahaz. We'll go through this really quickly. He's co-regent with his father Jotham for a few years, whereas in the northern tribes, Pekah, I don't know how you say his name, beats me. He's the king in Israel, and a man named Rezin is a king in Syria. Syria is also Aram, so when you see the Arameans and the Syrians in the Bible, same people. Don't let that confuse you, okay? Arameans, Syrians, same people, okay? Now, they assert themselves over Ahaz in Judah at the time of his father. Ahaz becomes sole ruler after his father dies. He engages in idolatry and child sacrifice, and he's faced with ongoing northern aggression. Pekah and Rezin ally themselves to try and bully Judah and Ahaz into helping them fight Assyria. Again, don't let Assyria and Syria confuse you. Two different things. Syria, smaller kingdom, Damascus. Assyria, great big rising empire that's going to be a lot of trouble in a few years, okay? So they ally themselves and say, hey, Ahaz, we're going to go fight Assyria because we're sick and tired of them bullying us. So we're going to bully you and try to get you to ally with us and come help us fight Assyria. You know what Ahaz does instead? He resists, and he says, no, thank you, I'm not helping you fight Assyria. So they attack Judah. They kill 120,000 of his soldiers, and they take 200,000 civilians from Judah captive. And it is in this moment that the prophet Isaiah comes to Ahaz in Isaiah 7 and reassures him and says, if you just trust God, everything will turn out okay. I promise. Trust God. Ask for a sign if you need to, and God will give you any sign to reassure you. Just trust God. Instead of trusting God, King Ahaz turns to the Assyrian king and says, they're bullying me, they're picking on me, they want me to fight against you, and I'll pay you anything if you come help me get out of this mess. So the Assyrian king says, Oh, I'll help you get out of that mess. Let me just make sure your check clears first, and I'll be right along to help you in a little while. And Assyria does fight against Israel and the northern tribes and against Damascus. But when they're finished with them, they come to Judah and start bullying them. Sure, great ally Assyria makes. He's your friend one moment because you paid him, and then the next moment when it fits his purposes, he fights against you, which is exactly what happens. In it for themselves, the Assyrians eventually turn on Ahaz and Judah. They impose a heavy burden on him, and he introduces brand new forms of idolatry in Judah. And that's a story all for its own day. Now, my slide is wrong on this one. I actually changed this slide earlier, but it came up wrong. I want to sum up Ahaz's rule with one verse from 2 Chronicles 28, okay? One verse says it all. 2 Chronicles 28, verse 19. The Lord humbled Judah because of Ahaz, for he brought about a lack of restraint and was very unfaithful to the Lord. That's it. That sums up his life. He was very unfaithful to the Lord. He brought about a lack of restraint in Judah, and they all paid the penalty for it. Every one of them paid the price for it. One writer put it really well in summing up Ahaz. He said, but before Ahaz died, all of this was changed. Enemy after enemy invaded his country. The land became desolate. Ahaz began badly, and every fresh movement in his life was a step from bad to worse. His history is a further illustration of how one sin leads to another. It was a continuously downward path. Good practical application there to think about. The Apostle Paul told Timothy once in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 13, that they'll proceed from bad to worse. And that's how sin works. Sin starts off bad, and it always escalates. It always gets out of hand. It spills out. It infects other things. It spreads like a cancer. When you let one sin into your life, before you know it, and I don't say this as a joke at all, you end up like Ahaz. How does a man go from having a father like Jotham, who served God and was pleasing to God? How does a man go from that to burning babies on altars to Molech and Baal? Burning babies. How do you get to that point? Because you open the door and let one sin in. And one sin leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to another. But it's the story of Isaiah 7 that we really want to focus on today. We'll only read a couple verses from it because it is a fairly long story. And so I don't want to take up all of our time with just the narrative, but I'll sum it up this way. In his moment of greatest need, when Pekah and Rezin, when they are coming to him and they're attacking Judah, and he's terrified and he wants to go to Assyria and ask Assyria to get him out of this pickle. He's willing to pay Assyria anything, just come help me. The prophet Isaiah comes to him, just as he came to his father and his grandfather before him, the great court prophet from of old. And Isaiah says to him, stop worrying about Israel and Syria. And don't turn to Assyria for help. God has this under control. If you just trust God and let God work his providence, just trust God and stop trying to take things into your own hands. Stop trying to take the easy way out. Stop trying to pay others to come in like mercenaries and fix your problems for you. Just trust God, and God has this thing under control. And so he begins here in Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 10. The Lord spoke again to Ahaz, saying, ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Make it as deep as the grave or as high as heaven. Essentially what God is saying through Isaiah is, if you need reassurance, if you're having a hard time trusting me, ask me anything you want, any sign that you want. Can you imagine having an offer like that? That is the offer of the ages. For God to come to you and personally say, if you're struggling right now and you need some help believing, I will do anything to help you believe right now. Any sign that you want to prove that I'm on your side. What an incredible, magnanimous, unbelievable offer. And so what does Ahaz do? Does he take him up on the offer? Does he say, wow, boy, I'm impressed. I'm humbled by this whole thing. God, I'm really going to have to think about what I need to ask. No, instead he says this horrible, horrible feigned humility. I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. And God does not respond this way. I understand that. This is, I guess, the Ryan Goodwin translation of it. But I imagine God saying something like, baloney. Now, God doesn't say that. But you read Ahaz's story and you go, okay, all right, Ahaz. I will not ask God. I would never test the Lord. Okay. You mean you'd never test the Lord like when you built idols and high places and offered sacrifices? You mean you would never test the Lord? Like, please, Ahaz. And the whole thing is fake humility. And God knows it. And Isaiah knows it. And so he's confronted then in verse 13. Listen now, O house of David. Is it too slight a thing for you to try the patience of men, that you will try the patience of my God as well? Therefore, in verse 14, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel, which means God is with us. He will eat curds and honey at the time he knows enough to refuse evil and choose good. For before the boy will know enough to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread will be forsaken. And the Lord will bring on you, on your people, and on your father's house such days as have never come since the days that Ephraim separated from Judah, the king of Assyria. Ouch. Ouch. And we'll talk about the sign in just a moment, but I want to look at practical lessons real quick here before we move on. First, trust is revealed by our actions. It's one thing to say you trust God or that you trust another person, you trust your spouse. That's one thing to say that you trust someone. Trust is revealed by our actions, though. And Ahaz reveals where his trust is. You can trust God, and God promises that this will turn out okay if you trust him. Someone get Assyria on the line for me. Empty out the coffers. Get the treasures from the temple. Prepare everything that we have for the biggest gift we can possibly give Assyria. He's going to cost a lot of money, but we need Assyria. Trust is revealed by your actions, not your words. Second, God can sniff out false humility. Paul also told Timothy one time, the Lord knows those who are his. And that's a great statement, isn't it? The Lord knows those who are his. He can sniff out the people who like to say pompous, loud prayers like the Pharisee standing in the temple. God, I thank thee that I'm so great and I'm on your team. You're lucky to have me. God can smell that from a mile away. He knows who the fakes are, and he knows who's really in it for him. Be careful what you don't wish for. That's an interesting thing, isn't it? I'll give you any sign that you want. As high as heaven, as low as the grave, ask me anything. No, thank you. Ahaz. When God offers you something, you take it. Be careful what you don't wish for, because instead of having the sign of his choosing, Ahaz gets the sign of God's choosing. All right, then, I will give you a sign myself. And the way it turns out, if you keep reading the chapter, really what God is promising in this sign is desolation for Judah. Read the rest of the chapter sometime, and he goes on and on and on about the land will be empty, the land will be desolate, everybody will be taken away, and the only thing left behind will be thorns and weeds and wild animals. You could have asked for a sign from God that would have reassured you and built up your faith. Instead, you reject God, and God will give you his own sign. Be careful what you don't wish for. Self-will makes us delusional. When we live for ourselves, me, I can do it myself. I don't need God's help. I don't need anybody else's help except for Assyria. I could really use Assyria's help right now. That'd be very convenient. Self-will is delusional. You do not have nearly as much control over your life as you think that you do. You do not have nearly as much safety and security as you think that you do. We're all just a single breath or a single heart attack away from it all being over. And we're going to have to answer for our faith or our lack of it. What about the sign, though? It's a difficult one, isn't it? You read in Isaiah 7 about this virgin that will be with child, and that will be the sign from God. Are we to take it literally? Is it just symbolic? And how do we make the connection to Jesus? Because Matthew chapter 1 explicitly states that Isaiah 7 is fulfilled in Jesus. In Matthew chapter 1. Well, there's been a lot of debate about it, and I'm not going to pretend like I have all the answers right here, but I view this sign as this is what God could do for you if you had just asked. That I told you that I'd give you any sign, and even things that are impossible. And so the sign that I'd be willing to give you, I would even be willing to give you the sign of a virgin who is with child. Not that there was literally in the time of Isaiah and Ahaz a virgin who was with child, because the fact that Jesus was conceived and born in such a way, I think has to stand alone in human history as a particularly unique thing about his situation. But I think what God is saying is, listen, if you had asked me for something astronomical, something impossible, I could do it. I would even go so far as to have a virgin with a child, like something that is biologically impossible. And so biologically impossible things are within the realm of reason and ability for God. And so I think this whole sign in Isaiah 7 is more like framing the expectation that you're supposed to have about God. Not that literally in the time of Ahaz, a virgin would be with child and that would be the sign. I think what he's saying is, Ahaz, listen, you could have asked for anything. And look how far I would have been willing to go. Look at the sign I would be willing to do for you. And within the time span of this child, this hypothetical child, this child that was within the realm of possibility, within the span of that child learning good and evil, everything would have been dealt with. Everything would have been answered. All your fears and your dread would be put to rest within so short a span of time as that. And I think that God is speaking more in hypothetical terms than he is literal terms at this point. But here's the cool thing about Jesus. Jesus takes that which is merely symbolic or hypothetical in another situation and makes it real and concrete in himself. Another good example is Ezekiel 37. Remember the story in Ezekiel 37 where Ezekiel sees this valley of dry bones and God brings all the bones back to life, and sinew and flesh and skin brings them back together, and God breathes new life into them? Do you suppose that literally the army of the undead woke up and was rejuvenated, or was God showing Ezekiel a sign that would ultimately and literally be fulfilled in the resurrection of the dead on the last day? We see in the symbolism and in the pictures of messianic prophecies in the Old Testament things that are only fully realized in Jesus. What is a shadow over here is the substance over here in Christ. So we get to Joseph, who can so aptly be described as the anti-Ahaz. That for everything awful that Ahaz does in testing and tempting God, in refusing a sign, in refusing to trust Him, in refusing to be faithful, for everything wrong that Ahaz does, God offers the same sign to Joseph in his moment of crisis. There will be a virgin with child, and He's God with us. What say you, Joseph? Matthew chapter 1. Joseph righteously, humbly, thoughtfully accepts that sign, that reassurance, and going against convention and custom and even his own instincts, he trusts God and is faithful to Him. And Joseph marries his betrothed, Mary, and he raises that child conceived by the Holy Spirit with the same love and care as if Jesus of Nazareth had been his own flesh and blood son. The final lessons that we look at then. Both Ahaz and Joseph are offered the same sign. We are also offered the same evidence. The empty tomb, the eyewitness testimony of those who saw Jesus raised from the dead, the accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John of incredible miracles and the teaching that Jesus did, the witness of history, the reliability of the Scriptures. We're also offered all the same evidence of the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We're offered the same evidence in the general revelation and the creation of who God is and what God offers to us in life and life eternal. Joseph is the perfect personification of the song that we sing sometimes, none of self and all of thee. It's not about me anymore. I was going to divorce Mary. I was going to put her away discreetly because of the embarrassment and the shame that she's put herself in by clearly having some kind of adulterous relationship, even before we've had the chance to consummate our marriage. That's what I was going to do. But God said, trust Him. Set aside your own self, your own will, your own desires, and do as God tells you to do. So none of self and all of thee. And Jesus is the fulfillment. Jesus is the fulfillment. There is no other way. There are no other options. Going back to Matthew chapter 1 one more time in verse 22. Now all of this took place that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled, saying from Isaiah 7, behold, the virgin shall be with child and shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which translated means God with us. The fulfillment of that prophecy was not John the Baptist. The fulfillment of that prophecy was not some false Messiah out there. You cannot come to God but through Jesus Christ alone. There is no other Christ, no other Messiah, no other salvation in no name other than the name of Jesus. He's the fulfillment. For whatever symbolism and mystery and shadows might have been in the Old Testament, the entire Old Testament points as a whole to Jesus as the answer and the substance and the source of all things. And so, what's your answer today? Are you Ahaz? And you always keep self-will in the back pocket? Me, my stuff, my will, my ideas? Or are you Joseph? And you're going to step forward in faith and trust that even though things might look bleak now, there's trials and troubles in this life aplenty for all of us to go around. but you're going to trust God and follow Him in His footsteps. What'll it be? If you have any spiritual need at all, I encourage you, please let that need be known by coming forward as we stand and sing right now.